I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Michael Ferris in 1996, a long time ago. And in 1998, began to journey with him on this exciting ride that would become Patrick Henry College. And over the years, I've come to know him as a warrior, but also a man of humility, and a man who follows hard after God's calling in his life. He's passionate. No one will ever meet Mike and doubt that. But he's passionate about things that matter. He is currently the president and CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom. And in that position, he brings a diverse background and effective as a litigator, an educator, public advocate, and communicator. And he's known for his ability to think very clearly about very complex subjects, which is something that's sorely needed in our current landscape of how can we sort through all the noise and think clearly about important issues, which is the hallmark of Patrick Henry College as well. In 1983, he founded the Homeschool Legal Defense Association and was a founding, really, architect of the homeschool movement in the United States. In 2000, he formed our college here, Patrick Henry College, and he continues as chairman of the board of HSLDA and as Chancellor emeritus at PHC. One of the things that I appreciate about Mike is his willingness to always come to the aid of PHC and to be willing to be here as often as we can ask him to be here. When we were thinking about kicking off our 20-year celebration, we were wanting to make sure that we were on Mike's calendar to do that, and in God's providence, it turned out that our celebration was delayed until August, and he can make it on his calendar. So would you join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Michael Ferris as he comes and delivers a very important commencement speech about the things that should matter to us as Americans. Thank you, Dr. Farris.
Thank you, Jack. It's a special honor to be able to address this class, even though many of our expected components of the celebration had to be adjusted. What will never change is the deep, abiding, and I trust wonderful memories of your time here at Patrick Henry College. It might be expected that I would focus today on the accomplishments of this college over the last 20 years, and there'd be a lot to talk about. The students and graduates of this college have exceeded my fairly expansive imagination, and I'm so proud of what you all have done and will continue doing. But today I want to focus on addressing a current challenge to the underlying philosophy of the college. PHC was founded on the wisdom of the Word of God and the founding fathers of this nation. But the wisdom and even acceptability of the founders of this nation is under direct assault today. I want to address this challenge and hopefully provide you all with an apologetic so that you can not only defend PHC's vision, but the very foundations of our country. So let's begin. There was a day, and it hasn't been that long ago, but there was a day when a political or civic leader would extol the genius of the American founding as the beacon of liberty that has not only made this nation great, but has changed the trajectory of the whole world. Such speeches were to be expected, almost trite. Audiences would think, why don't you tell us something we don't already know? But that day is gone. There is an open challenge to this view of America's founding. We're now told that America was born as an illegitimate state. It was founded by white men for white men. People of color were not included in the plans for the American dream. Women were left out of our founding documents and quietly ushered out of the corridors of power. America was born in shame, it was contended, and it all must be torn asunder so that a new society, a new government, a new culture can rise in its place. That's why we're seeing far more than the removal of Confederate monuments. Speaking of those monuments, in my humble view, they should have never been erected in the first place. But the ones we're seeing destroyed are different. Thomas Jefferson in bronze, destroyed in Portland, Oregon. Statue of George Washington was lit on fire and then pulled to the ground, again in Portland. Abraham Lincoln, who led the nation in an effort to drive slavery from our shores, has seen his memorial in the National Mall defaced with graffiti. A statue of Ulysses S. Grant, the general who successfully defeated the Confederacy, was toppled in San Francisco. Even abolitionists who were memorialized in bronze were defaced in Philadelphia. If that wasn't a sufficient mix of irony and evil, the first all-volunteer black unit of Union troops, the Shaw 54th Regiment, had its memorial defaced and damaged in Boston. But the efforts to destroy the story of America's greatness didn't stop there. The memorial to the greatest generation, the brave men and women who fought World War II and defeated Nazi Germany and the other National Socialist powers of Italy and Japan, that stunningly beautiful site on the Capitol Mall was defaced by protesters. These cannot be explained as attacks on racism. The incidents we have before us today are not merely attacks on American history, although they are that, but they are more fundamentally an attack on the legitimacy of America itself. The forces of Antifa and their radical comrades see themselves as the people who are doing the equivalent of tearing down the Berlin Wall. They see themselves as revolutionary liberators ushering in a new era. The profound irony, of course, and I may be getting ahead of myself in the story, is that they are seeking to build a new regime on American soil that most closely resembles the views, goals, and methodology of the Soviet bloc. In reality, they are tearing down the symbols of freedom so that they can fence us all behind a new Berlin Wall. My goal today is to analyze their claim that America was born as an illegitimate, repressive nation. I begin with an important observation. America was not born as a perfect nation. It's not a perfect nation today. There's much to be done. And I want to briefly mention a very personal application of some of that needed work. I have 26 grandchildren. 3 of them are black. I will almost certainly have more black grandchildren since my son and his stunningly beautiful wife from Nigeria have only one child born on February 29th of this year. Really cute. If you want to go to Facebook, you can see how cute this baby is. And they intend to have a larger family. Without a doubt, my black grandchildren will face challenges in their lives, both from officials and private individuals, that my white grandchildren will most likely never face. And that's just not right. It's not acceptable to me, it should not be acceptable to them, and it shouldn't be acceptable to anyone. Yet the acknowledgement of America's imperfections is the starting point for a correct understanding of America's founding. We need to understand an important historical detail that seems to be overlooked, misunderstood, and obfuscated by many, including the New York Times in its 1619 project. The American colonies have begun with the Mayflower and Jamestown, but the United States of America arose on July 4th, 1776. The colonial period was certainly influential in the shaping of America, but until we stepped away from the power structure of the colonizers, we were not American citizens. And the claims I am making are about the United States of America and make no defense of the British Empire in this continent or elsewhere. I'm an American citizen looking at our founding documents and examining the nation we have become since our nation was birthed in 1776. The decision to declare our independence was made on July 2nd. That was the equivalent of a decision of a young person to move out of their parents' house in the middle of a family fight. But 2 days later, a much more important decision was made. Similar to a decision to get married, the 13 colonies decided to become one nation, the United States of America. The Declaration's authors pointedly explained that its purpose was to explain to mankind the reasons that impelled them to be separated from England. In so doing, they boldly proclaimed the central purpose for the new nation. This paragraph is well known, but I quote it to you again. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. 3 fundamental principles were to be at the center of the new nation. All men are created equal. We're endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. Just governments are based on the consent of the governed. So let's pause and ask an important question. Were any of these things true in 1776? Was it the current reality that they were describing? No. None of those things were true. These principles were not where we were as a nation. It was a description of where we were going. These were the hopes, the dreams, and the aspirations of this new nation. Full equality was not the only thing that was missing at that moment. Self-government and the protection of inalienable rights were also very much in jeopardy. Each of these things lay somewhere in the future, but these dreams were the direction that the founders of our nation were willing to go, should it cost them their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. These were great ideals, but did every one of the signers of the Declaration live up to the lofty words? No. Several were slave owners, including Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, and other founders, including Patrick Henry, was a slave owner. Henry described slavery as indefensible, and yet he still owned slaves. He worked to abolish the slave trade and was successful with that, but he still owned slaves. Did the government they created, the first Articles of Confederation, and then 11 years after the Declaration, the Constitution of the United States, did these governments immediately fulfill all these ideals? No. It took until 1791, a full 15 years after the Declaration, just to get the Bill of Rights. And it took longer, much longer, painfully longer, to make substantial progress on the promise of equality. But America was not built on the personal fidelity of the founders of these promises. America was built on these core principles themselves. All men are created equal. All are endowed by God with inalienable rights. Government is to be by the consent of the governed, not just the privileged, all the governed. These ideals were bigger than the men who wrote them. If you have any knowledge of history, and I know that you do, because you've all had Dr. Spinney and Dr. Favolo and others, you will readily recognize that virtually every great leader fails at one time or another to live up to these principles, the principles that he taught. Moses was utterly instrumental in delivering God's promises and commandments to the children of Israel, yet Moses ultimately violated these commandments, and God wouldn't let him enter the promised land. Yet there is no doubt of the power of the message of Moses. Peter walked with Jesus, and Peter declared the central truth of the Christian faith. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And yet Peter denied Christ 3 times. Winston Churchill was instrumental in defeating Nazi Germany, and yet he was drunk more often than appropriate, and he frequently insulted Lady Astor, and I'm sure he did other crummy things too. Take any leader you want. Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Ronald Reagan, anyone. And we will find that they were flawed human beings who did not live up fully to the ideals that they taught us and urged us all to follow. Frederick Douglass, a former slave and a critical leader of the anti-slavery movement, about whom I'll have more to say in a few minutes, gave a very balanced assessment of the men who wrote the Declaration of Independence and founded this country. And I quote, "The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory." Douglass understood the flaws of men do not defeat profound truth. And the flaws of Thomas Jefferson, serious though they may be, do not overcome the power of his words. All people are in fact created equal. All of us are endowed by God with inalienable rights. Jefferson got it right. The story of America should not ignore its flaws. History should not be hagiography. But neither should we overlook the incredible power of the ideals that launched America and our many successes. The story of America is a positive one, very positive indeed. Look at where we started and look at the strides we are making. The ideals expounded in 1776 have been our goal, our guide, and our inspiration for continued improvement. And at the center of every major effort to improve upon our government living up to these promises, we will find the ideals of the Declaration and usually the document itself as the inspiration. On May 8th, in 1790, the Virginia Baptists met in Richmond in convention. This group had played an extraordinarily important role in the origins of the Bill of Rights. They extracted a promise from the Federalist James Madison, who didn't believe we needed a Bill of Rights, but in order to get the Baptist votes, he promised to make an introduction of the Bill of Rights, including protection for religious liberty. He got their votes, he kept his promise, and we got the Bill of Rights. Fresh from that accomplishment regarding inalienable rights, the Baptist group took aim at the twin promise of the Declaration, full equality. They adopted a resolution declaring that slavery, quote, is a violent deprivation of the rights of nature and inconsistent with a Republican government. And they called upon the people in the legislature of Virginia to extirpate the horrid evil from the land. A few years later, the Anti-Slavery Convention of 1833, which was a catalytic moment in the ultimate political process that led to the Civil War and the eradication of slavery, that 1833 convention issued its own declaration in self-evident reliance upon the Declaration of Independence. They called for the eradication of slavery to live up to the principles and live up to the promises of our founding. Their arguments were compelling and bold. No man has the right to enslave or imbrute his brother or to brutalize his mind by denying him the means of intellectual, social, and moral improvement. We need to now return to Frederick Douglass, a former slave, one of the greatest orators of all time. His speech on this issue is something you simply must read, and I don't say that lightly about anything, other than my 15 books, of course. But his speech, entitled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," is a true classic that will touch nearly everyone with emotions that are almost too powerful. His appeals to the promises of the Declaration of Independence are frequent and powerful. Concerning the promise of inalienable right to liberty, Douglass proclaims, and I'm quoting, "Would you have me to argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? What? Am I to argue that it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow man, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employments for my time and strength than such arguments would imply." There's much more, and it's hard to read, but it must be read. I was born in Arkansas, and I've lived here in Virginia for more than half my life. My Southern roots are real. But for my entire adult life, I have challenged any person who seeks to defend the South in the Civil War. Slavery was an unspeakable evil that rails against every human being's God-given conscience. My 14-year-old grandson, one of my 3 black grandsons, was walking down the street here in Purcellville. A voice from a passing car yelled the singularly most hateful racial epithet at my grandson. This person needs to read Frederick Douglass's speech, at least for starters. Yet, I see soft defenses of slavery and the Confederacy too frequently among Christians. For example, I see them in comments made by readers on my own Facebook page. They do this despite the fact that my main Facebook photo is a wedding shot of my son and daughter-in-law's wedding. She's the one from Nigeria, and yet on my page with that photo, they have the audacity to defend the Confederacy. Douglass laid the charge at America's feet. You're hypocrites. Your Declaration of Independence demands the eradication of slavery. Your Constitution has no provision that protects slavery, and its great moral thrust is the protection of liberty that denies the legitimacy of slavery. Your Bible defies those pastors who defend the legitimacy of slavery. Douglass closed his speech saying, "Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I, therefore, leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age." Douglass was not anti-American. He was not anti-founder. He was not anti-declaration. He was not anti-constitution. He was not anti-Christian. He expressed his clear belief in the ideals of each of these sources. His call was simple. Live up to the Bible. Live up to the Constitution. Live up to the guarantee of equality and rights proclaimed in the Declaration. Live up to the promise of American freedom. And this has been the same call that many other voices have raised to challenge America to do better. The women's suffrage movement wrote a historic appeal for their causes, fashioned identically after the Declaration of Independence, and their call was the same as Frederick Douglass. Live up to the promises of the Declaration. Even Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of my least favorite presidents, despite the fact that LBJ and I both were born on August 27th, so we share a birthday. And despite the fact when I was about 9 years old, I shook hands with him. He was at a parade that our family attended in Pasco, Washington. And about 2 weeks before that, I had fed a giraffe at the Portland, Oregon Zoo, and the giraffe licked my hand. And when I shook LBJ's hand, it felt exactly like a giraffe's tongue. Absolutely true. And I proved that to my mother. And if you need to know the proof, I'll tell you later. Despite the fact that I really don't like LBJ all that much, despite all these wonderful things I have in common with him, I have to say that LBJ's speech that he gave to the nation on July 2nd, 1964, as he signed the Civil Rights Act, you can watch it on YouTube, I suggest that you do it, a bill that truly advanced racial equality in our country in a very significant way. That speech was truly powerful and inspiring. And he repeatedly appealed to the promises of the Declaration and said, at long last, we are taking steps to live up to these promises. Every step toward genuine and appropriate equality has been achieved not by tearing down the Declaration and the premises of America. Rather, it has been a consistent, righteous voice that says we must live up to our own standards. This is not tearing down America. This is not denying the greatness of the American vision, the American founding. This is a call to build on the greatness of our ideals and consistently be the kind of people and kind of nation that our birthright requires us to be. Yes, there's much to be done. And I'll return to that thought in a moment. But it is more than appropriate for also to take stock in how much progress we have made. Slavery was abolished 155 years ago. Equal protection has been a constitutional guarantee for 152 years. These provisions eliminated de jure racism from the governmental sphere, although de facto racism persisted for a good while after that. But Brown versus the Board of Education marked the beginning of the end of de facto segregation by government, and that was 66 years ago. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 eliminated the legal framework for segregation and racism in the private economy as well. De facto problems persisted after that, but lawsuits and societal pressure have made the promises of the 1964 Act the usual rule in actual practice, although problems still persist. Any honest person who's approximately my age recognizes the absolutely dramatic societal improvements in this area. Take the issue of interracial marriage as a significant example. As recently as 1990, 6 out of 10 of non-black Americans said they would be opposed to a close relative marrying a black person. That number has fallen today to 1 in 10. We have come a very long way indeed. And yet, there's much to be done. All of this stands in stark contrast with what we are hearing from those who are destroying the statues and defaming the American dream. They say America was born in racism and sexism, and worst of all, in the views of these critics, it was born in capitalism and was far too Christian as well. America's founding was illegitimate, and the Constitution was polluted from the beginning, as was the Declaration of Independence. This is the cancel culture, and they aim at more than destroying individuals who stray from their orthodoxies. They aim to destroy our entire national history and rewrite our culture. But along the way, they are destroying individuals as well. Consider one of their more recent efforts. These are the people who destroyed the career of the director of communications of the Boeing Airplane Company. 33 years ago, he had the audacity, as a young Navy pilot, to write a column arguing that women should not be sent into military combat. That was a perfectly respectable view then, and it is still a perfectly honorable view that many Americans still hold. Again, the chief object of the cancel culture is to use coercion, economic, political, legal, and social coercion, to remake our society and our government into one of their liking. They scoff at the evidence of change over time. They ridicule the idea that we're getting better. Any flaw, any failure is fatal. They accept no nuance because nuance, like truth, does not fit their narrative. They've announced their goal to defund and dismantle the police, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. They want to dismantle every aspect of the existing power structure that they claim is systemically racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. Their goals are revolutionary, and their tactics are always coercive. Any student of socialism knows that it is a violent philosophy that justifies tyrannical uses of power to achieve what it believes to be the greater good. Far too many people fail to understand the truth about socialism. They need to read Witness by Whittaker Chambers to understand the intrinsic relationship between socialist theories and violent coercion. They need to read The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn to see how these theories play out in real life. They need to tour the Romanian orphanage that I did just a few weeks after the fall of communism to see the consequences in real, live human beings of their discredited theories. They've obtained their beliefs, not by surfing the internet and being radicalized by foreign socialists. These radicals believe what they've been taught for the last 40 years in the academy. The events in Seattle paralyzed left-leaning political officials because the officials recognized, to their own shame, that they were exactly the same in their philosophy as the radicalized mob, but the mob was simply acting on what they all professed to believe. Let us not think that this is a moment that can be easily shrugged off. With Boeing doing their bidding and the New York Times seeking to further indoctrinate every American student in this philosophy through the 1619 Project, this is a revolutionary moment and movement that must be taken very seriously. This movement has forthrightly declared that it doesn't even believe in the First Amendment. Once considered absolutely sacred territory for most Americans, Catherine McKinnon, who teaches law at the University of Michigan Law School, complains that free speech now serves to reinforce and amplify injustice. She said, once a defense of the powerless, the First Amendment over the last 100 years has mainly become a weapon of the powerful. Louis Michael Seidman, who teaches law at Georgetown, wrote in the Washington Post, commenting on a case that I argued and won in the Supreme Court. When I was younger, he said, I had more of the standard liberal view of civil liberties. What I have come to see is that it's a mistake to think of free speech as an effective means to accomplish a more just society. At its core, free speech law entrenches a social view at war with key progressive objectives. He didn't like the fact that we'd successfully defended the free speech rights of pro-life pregnancy centers in California. And we see this cancel culture in operation every day. When there are calls to destroy the Goya Food Company simply because the CEO said something nice about President Trump, having also said something nice about President Obama, we see that the cancel culture is extraordinarily serious. They do not believe in the old adage, I may disagree with everything you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That one statement sums up American philosophy as well as any other. People who reject the freedom of speech for all reject the essence of what it means to be an American. I would submit that we cannot gain victory over this movement through business as usual from either conservative or political efforts, even though such efforts are entirely needed. We must counter their efforts to force this philosophy on our country by powerfully demonstrating the superiority of our own revolutionary philosophy, the one derived from the revolution launched in 1776. The way forward must be built on the principles of our founding. The time has come for a clear and unmistakable defense of the legitimacy of our founding ideals: equality for all, inalienable rights for all, and rule by the consent of the governed. These ideals arise from a moral view of the world that shines far more brightly than anything the other side can offer. But as we defend our ideals, we need to defend them all. We cannot protect God-given rights unless we're also committed to equality. And we cannot achieve equality without protecting God-given rights. And there are some rights that are particularly at risk today, and we must strongly defend each one. The right to life from conception to the natural death is the starting point, of course. The freedom to not just believe what we want about God, but to exercise our beliefs in everyday life. Freedom that is for all people of all faiths. The freedom of all people to speak messages that I don't like, and my freedom to speak messages they don't like as well. Property rights, Second Amendment rights, and all other protections of the Bill of Rights must be zealously protected. We must demonstrate that the market economy has not only been a powerful engine for prosperity, it has been the vehicle which has made it possible for the outpouring of unparalleled acts of charity that flow from the Christian duty to help those in need. And we must insist on governmental compliance with the principle of self-government. No one except the people themselves and their elected legislators can make law. We're experiencing daily denials of this principle with edicts from governors who are substituting their own whims for properly enacted laws. The rules of the Constitution must be observed at all times, even in emergencies. This includes the rule that only legislators can make law. We live in a precipitous moment of our nation's history. We must choose between two revolutionary paths. One path promises utopia, but will deliver coercion and mediocrity. The other path, following the revolution of 1776, will deliver imperfections, improvements, and freedom. As for me, even with imperfections, I choose the American dream of equality, God-given rights, and self-government. America started with a dream of liberty in a land rife with difficulties. We still have difficulties, and we must still absolutely strive to improve. But we must not be the people that relinquish the American promise. We are created equal. We are endowed by God with inalienable rights. We will pursue equality. We will insist on our rights. We will stand strong for freedoms. We are Americans. Thank you very much.